Dr. Landau, we're listening, when you listen to John Kerry, and you actually nodded your head now, as we all listen to it in studio, simply demanding that Iran capitulate is not a viable plan. Netanyahu did stand on that stage. He claimed three things that weren't, I don't know if they're feasible. They need to stop supporting terror, they need to stop threatening the annihilation of Israel. But that's not a viable plan. What is a plan, in your mind?
No, I think what Netanyahu said in that regard has been misconstrued. He didn't say that those three things needed to be done before there is a deal. He said very clearly that before restrictions are lifted, he's relating to the sunset provision. Right. There's a very problematic element in the negotiation, and that is the sunset provision. In other words, the idea that after 10 to 15 years, all of these restrictions that whatever restrictions are put on Iran will be lifted without there being any talk about Iran's motivation in the nuclear realm, which we know is aspiration to a military capability. And what he's saying is, at least with regard to the sunset provision, don't lift the restrictions until Iran fulfills those conditions. In other words, he's not saying that needs to be done now before the deal. He's saying that needs to be done before the deal is lifted. And I think he has a very, very, very valid point in that regard. That was probably the only element that was new in what he said. But Yael, I want to ask you, how many times have we sat here and heard the negotiators come out of the negotiations and say there has been progress, but we still have substantial issues in dispute? We hear this mantra every time it ends. We never hear the details.
Not to play devil's advocate.
We never know what's
not to
going
play
on.
devil's advocate, but isn't that actually the process of negotiations in every place? Obstacles remain what not. I know. I'm lifting that. And we do not know all the details of this framework agreement.
But this is the problem. They're playing with this issue of the details, right? On the one hand, they don't disclose details. On the other hand, some of the criticism that was leveled at Netanyahu was, we haven't heard anything new. Well, you demanded that Netanyahu not say anything new, and then you castigate him for not saying anything new. So either disclose the information or don't disclose the information. But you can't have it both ways and criticize those that are criticizing the negotiation for both reasons. And a final point, Netanyahu really is not talking about capitulation, even though I think it's unfortunate to talk about the steps that Iran has to take in terms of capitulation. Iran is a violator of the NPT. It's been working on a military capability for decades, and that's why these negotiations are ongoing. And yes, indeed, Iran has all the work to do in order to convince the international community that it has backed away from those aspirations. And therefore, when Secretary of State Kerry stands there and says, we want to do everything possible to ensure that Iran's nuclear activities are solely peaceful, my question as an analyst who's been following this for 12 years is, why in the world is the IAEA investigation into the weaponization aspects of Iran's nuclear program not squarely on the agenda of the political talks? It's in a parallel process being led by the IAEA. The head of the IAEA keeps saying that Iran is not cooperating with their investigation. Just 10 days ago, or 2 weeks ago, there was the latest report of the IAEA, again saying that Iran is not cooperating with the investigation. We know they have been stonewalling. So how in the world are you talking about ensuring that this is purely peaceful when you're not confronting Iran on the issue that is at the heart of this negotiation, which is Iran's weaponization work, that is the clearest violation of the NPT and the reason why Iran cannot be trusted, and all of the demands for dismantlement? I'm confused, and the administration is not giving answers. And to brush away, aside the criticism, to marginalize all criticism as, you don't know the details, you're a warmonger, you're a hawk, all the things we've been hearing over the past year, that's not a serious approach. If this administration is so sure about the way it's negotiating, then deal with the criticism head on. Don't marginalize it. The concerns that Netanyahu has raised are concerns that I have raised in my writing, other experts on this issue have raised in their writing, and they're across the board. It's not a political issue. Many experts in the United States saying the same thing, nuclear experts that are very, very concerned. This isn't about politics. It's not about Netanyahu.
It has become, though, about politics.
This
you know
is
it
true.
has become about politics.
It has.
Yeah.
However, I think Netanyahu's speech, actually, maybe even ironically, might be the element that will change the debate a little bit. If you look at the editorials that came out in the Washington Post and even an op-ed in the New York Times, the message that they're saying is Obama needs to answer the concerns raised by Netanyahu. And I would add, they're not just raised by Netanyahu.
No,
they're
not just
serious concerns.
Okay, then let's say we get to March 31st, and there is a framework, and it's a framework agreement also.
Now they're only talking about an understanding. They've already backed away from
the framework. So in many ways, clearly there are things that remain on the table that are not being resolved. But there's also a point that was raised in the studio yesterday, shortly after the speech, that said that, you know, what is another option? At the end of the day, you know, when Kerry says not capitulating, but sanctions themselves, and over the course of the last 10 years, we've seen Iran edge towards this type of a capability, actually also under the, you know, not under the leadership, but Netanyahu has been prime minister over the course of the last 6 years. They're edging forward. Sanctions did not work in the case of Korea. Sanctions historically have not worked in stopping countries. So isn't, you know, wouldn't the argument of the United States, and I'm asking you to sit and speak with the people in question because there's nothing else to do, and maybe there are details that we don't know. What are the details that you, as an expert, would be happy with in an agreement as such?
No, look, of course this needs to be settled through negotiations. And actually, Netanyahu, for the first time, said explicitly what I think needed to be said. Rather than saying, if this doesn't work, Israel will take care of its own security with very, you know, strong hints that Israel might take military action, for the first time he said, the alternative is not war. That's not what the critics are talking about. The critics are saying, negotiate better, do a better job. You have leverage. You have leverage, and you have had leverage for 13 months. Use it. What does it mean to use it? It means when you're at the negotiations table and Iran says on any issue, let's say the ballistic missiles, that's non-nuclear, we're not talking about it. Don't accept that. The fact that Iran says we don't want to talk about that should not mean that that becomes your position. You, I mean the P5+1. You need to use your leverage to bargain effectively. You say to Iran, no, guess what? Ballistic missiles are one component of a nuclear weapons capability, and we will discuss it. And by the way, it's included in a UN Security Council resolution from 2010, and that's why you're going to discuss it. Don't say, because the Iranians say no, we can't deal with it. This is the problem with the negotiation. Too quickly accepting all of the things that Iran says it won't deal with as, okay, we can't do it. And understand that even if Iran gets upset and leaves the negotiation, they will come back, because now for the first time the P5+1 do have leverage through the sanctions that still exist. The Iranians are at the table in order to get sanctions lifted, and to do that they need the cooperation of the international community, first and foremost America. So use that. Know that the Iranians are not going to leave, and even if they leave temporarily, they will come back, but the P5+1 will be in a stronger position to get Iran to agree to their very legitimate demands. That's what it means to bargain.
Said Em8ily Landau, which I'm thinking we should send you to that. Seriously, you should be sitting at that table, but I'm not releasing you to go over to Geneva. You're locked at this table for now. As we look at the impact of both the end of the negotiations and the Netanyahu speech, ahead of delivering his Congress speech, Netanyahu came under harsh criticism by his political opponents at home. And, you know, they claimed he charged ahead with the speech against the White House, whatnot. And in order to, you know, reap political benefits, and that leads me to you, Nimrod. That's an argument that many people make towards Netanyahu, that it has been a political game for him. And actually, you know what? I'm going to start with Tal Schneider.
I just want to say something regarding what Em8ily just said. She actually explains much better things that were, you know, for me, sitting there above Netanyahu's head on the galley of the reporters, I couldn't figure out from his speech. So she explained it much better than him. Regarding specifically the fact that the terms are now regarding the sunset provision. And he made it seem like those are terms that he wants to, you know, be overcast above all. just don't talk with Iran. But it wasn't perceived like that. And when reporters, and I was sitting next to American reporters, and when they were listening to the prime minister, the first notion they got were like, oh my God, he's demanding a regime change. And a regime change, when you say that to American people,
that's a huge statement.
That was written in the entire U.S. press. So one of the problems with Netanyahu is that he's not doing hasbara. He's not explaining himself. He's not talking to reporters. And I was on the plane on the way there and on the way back. He's not talking to the press, not to the Israeli press specifically, and he's not talking to the American press. He's only doing the speech. He brought himself to the political point where the U.S. administration and the U.S. public is can't even listen to him anymore because of the way, the blunt and rude way it was done. There is no even an open mind to listen to factual-based arguments like were mentioned here.
It's also the problem of the other side that is not open to listening.
But there is both sides to the wedding, as you may say. And we are getting to the point where 2 weeks before election, instead of having a debate within the Israeli political leaders, we have a debate, a forceful debate between our prime minister and the U.S. president. And we are watching it from the side. We are not even part of it because we can't interview neither of them. The debate is taking place on social networks.
They're speaking to each other via speeches or little sound bites.
It seems bad if you look from this. And I do agree that I don't think any other political leader in Israel will approach these things probably differently. I mean, there's no argument, but it's unexplained. It's really unexplained.
It's unexplained, and it goes in with that criticism, though, that you have just mentioned towards Prime Minister Netanyahu, which comes also from within Israel, is what sparked, I'm leading back to Nimrod, is what sparked, a very valid point, is what sparked a movement called V15. V15 in Israel, Vote 15.
Victory.
Victory 15. I'm American. Yeah, amen. Victory 15, a movement that was is much talked about in Israel. And it's a movement that basically has one agenda, and that's replacing Netanyahu and campaigning and grassrooting in that. You are the campaign manager of V15. Before we explain exactly what that means and how it falls into the parameters of this entire story, let's take a look at a clip of V15 and what it means.
Let's go.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this deadly game of thrones, history has placed us at a fateful crossroads. We must now choose between two paths. One path leads to a bad deal. It will only change the Middle East for the worse. The second path, however difficult, could lead to a much better deal. Now we're being told that the only alternative to this bad deal is war. That's just not true. The alternative to this bad deal is a much better deal. Now, I want you to think about that. Literally.
Okay, so you took the speech.
Yeah. And we kind of changed it around.
And you kind of changed it for, yeah. Okay, Nimrod. Here's the thing. It was a very controversial movement several weeks ago, V15. But what stands behind the idea of just, you guys are going to people's houses. You knocked on my door, actually.
Yeah, we already knocked on 100,000 doors all over the country. And we ask people to pledge to change the government. We're not an anti-Netanyahu movement. We're anti-the-right movement. We want to change the government from the right to the center and the left.
Well, there are those who will argue that that's a statement. It does feel like it's just changed the regime, changed the apropos regime change.
Netanyahu is Netanyahu is a symbol for a set of values we do not support.
Okay. The reaction to your, as you're grassrooting, as you're going through doors, what is the feeling of, the Israeli voter? Because the last 48, I would say the last 3 weeks, with, when it comes to Israel, when it comes to what matters, was only the speech and Iran and security and whatnot. Does the Israeli voter, in your mind, because you guys have been speaking to people, you've been knocking on doors, do they care about anything else?
They don't care at all about Iran. When you come to people's houses, when you knock on their
Tyler
doors...
Schneider is smiling, yeah, okay.
It shows in the polls. I mean, they care about the economy.
Exactly.
Sure.
When you go to their houses and you ask them, why do you want to change the government? And their eyes are lighting up, and they say, I want to change the government because I don't see an economic future over here. I'm afraid for my job. I'm afraid for housing. They're afraid for tons of stuff which are not at all related to security in Iran. Some people say, yeah, maybe Iran, ISIS, stuff like that, but it's not the major thing. And as the age of the voter gets lower and lower, and out of the age of 50, they all talk only about economy. Only
economy. I wonder if that translates into the polls, but we're going to start with you, Tal, first, before we look at these polls. You came off that plane. It was a show. It was a political show. It was Netanyahu at his best, the orator of the century. Does that register here in Israel? Do you think that's going to make a dent?
I have to tell you, first, I was in AIPAC also and in the Congress, and obviously the Prime Minister is admired over there. And you can see I was, again, sitting in front of the Republican Party, and you see in their eyes, they have like their own campaign coming up in 2016.
Exactly.
And they're looking at him, and they're like, oh my God, can we have him please for our campaign? I mean, there isn't any candidate in the Republican Party that is doing such a fantastic job in getting into the president's, getting him upset. I mean,
under his skin, under Obama's skin.
So they need someone like that. And I actually saw that, and I thought to myself, oh my God, Sarah Netanyahu was absolutely right with the things she said that were published in Ma'ariv about how Netanyahu is, really, really going to be a good candidate for the U.S. presidential elections. That was amazing. But then you get off the plane and you get out of AIPAC and you land back in Israel, and the 16,000 AIPAC members and the 500 plus Congress members don't have the right to vote here.
Exactly.
And they don't even affect the Israeli public opinion, because Israeli public opinion polls indicate that all the Israeli care is about the housing crisis and the end of the month, the economy. And if you see the polls, Iran is down there at 10%, where the economic issues are above 50.
Let's take a look at I mean, these are the recent polls in. Let's look at the numbers. First poll in, that's Channel 2, Israeli mainstream channel, primetime mainstream channel. Likud at 23 mandates. Zionist Union, and this is as recent, I believe, as post the speech, at 24 already. The Jewish Home 12, that would be the I would say, the partners of a Likud party in the event that that's a coalition that is formed. Okay, looking at that, still, it's a very...
You do have to convince voters on the topics that are on their mind, and you
but
cannot convince them to vote.
Looking at Nimrod, when you look at these numbers, 23, versus 24, still, but to both of you, Nimrod, let's start with you. That's smack in the middle.
But it's a matter of recommendations. How many recommendations the president will get for a different nomination to be the prime minister, and the meaning of all of that numbers is that every vote counts. That if we want to really change the government, everyone needs to get out of the house and put the right ballot in the ballot box. That's it.
Yeah, I can add that the Likud had to campaign in the last couple of weeks about the economy. It was unpleasant for them, and they decided not to touch it. But obviously, they could have come with a plan to the public, saying, "Okay, maybe we made some mistakes, but we are going to do A, B, C."
Not to touch the economy.
They decided not to touch it. They could have come with a plan and say, "We need to do A, B, C," and maybe the voters will, their base would, listen to them and believe in them. But they didn't come up with a written plan, and people don't like it. They don't like it that they don't see a policy or planning for what's going to happen next if they'll vote for them. So that's a problem for the Likud, and it's showing up in the polls.
If I may, every time these elections became something about not security, not Iran, the Likud tried to spin it back to those issues. Every time there was something about the housing or the state of the economy, or when people have been aggravated about actual day-to-day lives, the Likud spinned it around. And we've seen it with the attack on us, which was all a spin to change the focus of attention on the Likud. And we've seen it now that we had the housing report by the state controller, and whoop, here we go, Iran again, Iran. It's for Netanyahu, it's okay to be in the safe side of what he's good at. But what about what's good for us?
Em8ily, I was waiting for you to jump in and say and disagree. Yes.
No, I just have a question. If it is the case that the Israeli people care about the economy and not about Iran, why were the other parties, the opposition, so worried about Netanyahu going to Congress and this helping him in the elections?
As a journalist, I can
if
answer
it's
that
your
it's an amazing...
assessment that doesn't speak to the people.
Well, after a month of talking about Iran, constantly, or we do it, reporters, you do still see in the polls that people are more concerned about the economy. And of course, the opposition was worried that people will, the polls will shift. But I have to say something. Israeli public is talking about economy every time before election, but when it goes to the polls, sometimes it dumps at the end of the day, on the day of the voting process, there
is the point more that when the Israeli voter goes into the booth,
polls, they forget what they said a month before.
I totally disagree about it. I'm sorry. If you look at Lapid, for example, Lapid was not elected for security issues.
A few years time.
Again, rise in seats because of he talked about the middle class and what's happening to him, and this is
which is a problem in this round of election, because people won't believe that white horse course of the last election, and when it comes to economy and they walk into the booth, who do they have to vote for?
So when people go to the polls, at the end of the day, voting process is an emotional process, and they get out of their guts, their gut feeling, and then sometimes on that day, obviously, all the fears and the worries are coming out, even though they said a month ahead that they only care about the economy.
Right.
So that's the reason the Likud is playing that card, constantly. I have to say there's another thing that is interesting. Netanyahu and Ya'alon and also Herzog, in the last few weeks, they kept saying, don't vote for the small parties, vote for the big parties, because we need to run the government. Right. We want to be big. I just heard on the way here, Ya'alon, the defense minister, saying, you don't go for the fashion, parties, just go for the big establishment. And you know what? People are not listening. They just, they hear him, and still on the polls they go for Likud, for the Lapid and the Kachlon.
For the smaller
so
parties,
they're not convinced by this message who says, vote for the big ones.
You got 2 seconds.
See what happens.
Yeah, well, we do have to see. We can't count on the polls so much, though.
Yeah.
Usually they say there are about 25, 30 seats of undecided votes, and they all decided in the last 3 days. And this is a major.
It's a major. The last 3 days. Actually, I think the next several days are going to be incredibly interesting.
Some people make a decision on the voting day.
On the voting day, of course. I may be one of them. Just well. You never heard from me. Okay, but guys, thank you so much for being with me.